My name is Regina Shannon, and I am the author of 14 novels. This is going to be a movie review from a writer's perspective of the movie entitled The Big Clock, which was made back in 1946. This movie was produced by Richard Maybaum, directed by John Farrow, and it was based on a novel also called The Big Clock by Kenneth Fearing. The screenplay was written by Jonathan Latimer. The movie stars Ray Milland as George Stroud, Charles Laughton as Earl Janeth, the owner of the publishing conglomerate, Maureen O'Sullivan, who plays Georgette Stroud, George's wife, George McCready, who plays Steve Hagen, who is Janeth's right-hand man, and other stars who appear are Elsa Lanchester and Rita Johnson. The movie is based on a novel written by Kenneth Fearing, who had another bestseller in 1939 entitled The Hospital. Paramount bought the rights to The Big Clock to produce this psychological film noir. I chose to review this movie and will be reviewing the movie entitled No Way Out because they are both based on the underlying novel The Big Clock. Each story follows the basic storyline. However, I believe writers can learn so much by seeing how the screenwriters change the underlying story enough to create two different stories from the same premise. So this is the first of two movie reviews. This review today will not have any spoilers so as not to ruin the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it. The movie is a psychological thriller that moves fast and it's well worth watching. However, as I finish my complete analysis of both movie plots, I will post the links in the description box below for any writers or anyone else who is interested in watching those. Now, before I begin the review, I want to mention something so anyone who is under 40 can understand a little bit about the actual building and its clock. Janeth Publications produces several magazines, and it is located in a huge building in New York City. The building is in a large high-rise with a big clock that can be seen from outside. Now, this was a big to-do back in 1946, and there's very little mention of the clock itself in the movie, but it does play a small role later on in the plotline. I wanted to mention this for anyone who is too young to remember how big building clocks or digital clocks were at one time considered the height of technology. This is not explained in any detail in the movie, and I just wanted to cover it before I begin the actual movie review because tourists are mentioned later on in the story. And without knowing what a big deal this building with the clock was, you may not understand that one reason for the tourists was to see the big clock. The movie was produced in 1946, so this live display here of the time was considered cutting edge technology. The movie opens with a flash forward where the viewer sees George Stroud, the main character, frantically running around the building. He winds up on the top floor inside the clock area, and he is wondering out loud how he got himself into this mess. The viewer is given a glimpse of what is to come. For writers out there, this is considered the hook. In the next scene, the movie begins in real time, and we are introduced to Janeth Publications, a large, busy company that produces magazines, one of which is called Crime Ways. We then meet George Stroud, who is played by Ray Milland, and who is the editor-in-chief of Crime Ways magazine. He and his staff are all bustling about in the office trying to get the magazine ready for release. George is rushing to get everything done because he is leaving at the end of the day for a week's vacation. to go on a honeymoon with his wife, Georgette, and their son. Apparently, George had to cancel his first honeymoon due to a work emergency. But this week, he is planning to make it up to his wife with a trip to West Virginia. He's excited and looking forward to going. In the next scene, we see a beautiful, smartly dressed blonde woman who is snooping around and looking through items on the big boss's desk. She is also listening to the conversation going on in George's office through an intercom that Earl Janeth, the big boss, uses to listen in on his employees. She listens in as George is now telling Steve Hagen, who is Janeth's right-hand man, that he can't cancel his honeymoon again, and he goes into a whole tale of woe about having been called away on an emergency on his first honeymoon and how mad and disappointed his wife is. He's trying to get Hagen to see things from his wife's perspective, and this is what the blonde woman is listening to in Janet's office. Then the big boss, Earl Janeth, played by Charles Laughton, comes into his office and sees this woman, who we find out is his mistress, Pauline York, who has managed to get through security and then into his office. He sees her rummaging through paperwork on his desk, and he hears her listening over his intercom to what George Stroud is talking about with Hagen in the next office. He's not happy, and he asks her how she got in. She brags about coming up in his private elevator and flirting her way past security. Not liking to be out of control, Janeth walks her out to the public elevators and whispers that he will see her later at 10:50. There is tension between them, and the viewer gets to know he pays her bills, including her singing lessons. This confirms that she's the mistress. In the next scene, Hagen is telling George that Janeth wants him to postpone his honeymoon so he can finish the Fleming investigation. George pleads his case and tries to convince Hagen that his wife deserves a honeymoon. Hagen lightly threatens him, but George stands his ground and he finally storms out of the conversation and returns to his own office. Hagen reports to Janeth that he was not successful in getting George to stay, and Janeth is not happy. Janeth then secretly and silently plots another approach. In the next scene, George is sitting at the bar waiting for his wife. Pauline York, the mistress, sidles up to him and says she wants to tell his fortune. She then repeats everything she overheard him complaining about when she was eavesdropping on him from Janet's office. As she repeats everything he was saying a few minutes earlier, George is now on to her. She then tells George that she has her own problems with Janet and suggests that maybe they should put their heads together to get even with him. Once these words are out of her mouth, George's wife walks up to them and the suggestion is dropped. George is now focused on his wife. The wife is not happy about seeing her husband talking with a beautiful blonde. After a slightly tense moment between the women, Pauline leaves and George smooths down his wife's feathers by showing her he has reserved a table with champagne for them to toast the beginning of their honeymoon. His wife settles down and she confirms that she has the train tickets to West Virginia, where they will be going on the honeymoon. In the next scene, it's now after lunch and George is again rushing to get everything done at work. At about 4 p.m., Janeth strolls out of his office and over to George and joins him in front of George's Crime Ways clue chart that he uses in his investigations. Janet compliments George on always being able to solve their crimes before the cops have to get involved, and George explains in detail about how he uses the clue chart to keep track of all of the clues, and he isolates an irrelevant clue, and that helps him break the case every time. Janet is acting so impressed, but he is just getting ready to give George an ultimatum. George has no idea what's coming. Janet continues buttering George up and slowly walks him into his office. He goes on and on about how he and George have been comrades in arms at work, etc. Then he tells George that he wants him to finish the Fleming case because that will increase their circulation by at least 10%. Then Janet tells him he wants him to work on this nonstop for the next month. At this point, George realizes that his boss is telling him to cancel his vacation. This time, George protests and he says he won't do it. After the buttering up of George hasn't worked to manipulate his employee, Janet resorts to threats. He tells George if he doesn't stay, he'll lose his job and Janet will blacklist him throughout the industry. He'll never work in this town again. George is furious, but he doesn't relent this time. He storms out in anger. There is now an assumption that George has walked out on his job. Still mad, George goes into his office and his secretary tells him a woman is on the phone and she wants to tell his fortune. George knows it's Pauline and he picks up the call. He then blurts out that Janet has just fired him. Pauline asks him what he's going to do. He says right now he needs a drink. She wants to go with him, but he refuses at first. Then she says she may have a plan to get Janet to do what each of them wants. She tells him it will be worth his while to at least listen. He agrees. She meets him at the bar, and after one too many drinks, George manages to get himself into trouble. But I won't go into any more detail so as not to ruin the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it. Now, what can a writer learn from this movie? This movie has it all. A writer can learn about subtly dropping clues along the way that seem unimportant but will be crucial by the end of the story. This movie also demonstrates how to slowly drip the clues into the storyline. This movie was only an hour and a half, and it was packed with physical clues, visual clues, and crucial dialogue. This movie can also teach writers about ratcheting up the stakes. At first, George's biggest problem is his wife's disappointment and the pressure she puts on him because of always giving in at work. Then his boss's demands about an ongoing Fleming investigation adds to his stress. But then George finds himself in a situation where he may be blamed for something he hasn't done. On top of that, he's then selected to run an investigation where everyone is looking for him and he's the only one who knows this. This movie also contains crucial dialogue that sets up and then plays out the psychological drama and power plays between Janet, George, and even Steve Hagen, the right-hand man. It shows the plotting and scheming on both sides of this criminal investigation, what's going on between Janet and Hagen, and then what George chooses to do in response to everything that happens to him. This dialogue between these three characters shows a psychological cat and mouse game that takes place as George slowly starts connecting the dots on what is really going on with everyone. Watching and listening to this intricate drama play out can help new writers see the difference between dialogue that just moves the scenes forward and crucial dialogue that is part of the psychological plot line of the story. This is best learned by viewing it in action. All three actors use words, emotions, and posturing to act out this psychological dance going on between them. It gets more intense as the story climaxes. This is a must-watch for new authors. This screenplay script is also very tight. There's not one word spoken or action taken that isn't driving this entire narrative forward. The storyline and plotline are a masterpiece. This is a must-see for anyone new to writing novels or screenplays. There are also a few shocking developments and twists the viewer does not see coming. A new writer can study how this was done and how the writer chose to spring it on the viewer from out of nowhere. Once you see it, you realize the author hid this surprise from the beginning. This is also a story where a character gets trapped in a physical location. This premise alone requires the character to try to escape, and there are multiple close calls, all of which build tension and suspense for the viewers. Watching the close calls can teach us about how a character almost gets caught and how the timing is crucially important. This isn't hard, but you will learn how the writer needs to be clever to pull it off. This is another movie that was made almost 80 years ago, but it has aged well. Aside from the clock being no big deal by today's technology standards, the rest of the drama is based on human frailty, and that is ageless. So the premise, the plot line, the characters, the mystery, and the suspense all still work. Now let's talk about who to watch. Ray Milland, who plays George Stroud. He was great at being frantic, hitting all of his marks as he tried to get himself out of one jam after another. One minute he was busy at work, then fighting with his boss, then trying to handle his long-suffering wife. And then he goes into a race around the building to hide and try to find evidence that will help him, all of which gets physical. He hit every mark, delivered all his lines, some of which were part of this cat and mouse game that goes on. He gets A plus for his performance. Charles Laughton, who played Earl Janeth. Now, he played the stingy, tyrannical boss, and he was great in it. He too acted with his body, emotions, and facial expressions, especially during the cat and mouse sequences, as well as some other scenes that I won't reveal so as not to spoil anything. He also gets an A plus. Now you need to watch George McCready, who plays Steve Hagen, Janet's right-hand man. In the beginning, he was a lightweight playing a flunky for Janet, but he goes on to have more of a significant role as the drama plays out. He too gets A plus in acting. Now, this movie also had a few quirky characters who were funny and added a little comic relief during the movie. I'm not going to tell you who they are in the story, but I will say that one of them was played by Charles Laughton's wife, Elsa Lanchester, who is one of my favorite character actresses. As usual, her role is small, but she was a riot. Another few characters who George runs into at a local bar are funny and lovable too. This can also teach new writers how comic relief can be used in a serious script and in what doses to use them. Now, I purchased this movie on YouTube to watch it. It was $3.99, but YouTube only gives you a 48-hour rental window for this price. I believe Amazon Prime, which is the same price, is not as strict with how many times you can view it, and some writers may want to view it more than once. It's also on Google Play, which I know nothing about. I will also leave a link to justwatch.com where you can see where the big clock is playing. either for free or for pay. They also have listings of where you can purchase the movie if you like to collect them. Now, I hope you enjoyed this movie review video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I'll leave you with this panel of all of my books that are available to purchase on Amazon.com. Many of them are in Kindle Unlimited. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.